That sounds like a pretty reasonable request, then.
Well, I'm surprised that it came to the desk per,
A visiting desk
a
per.
visiting desk per.
Right, so I called, I went down to see the post commander, and I was doing my gig, doing my other stuff, and I said, is it possible to have a traffic light hung there within the next 2 days? Because I'm going to be on this post for 2 days doing business. So we got traffic engineers out and all that kind of stuff, and they began to put the light up within 2 days. So then you said to this guy, as the post commander, he said, would you tell me why it is I have to come in here from Washington to figure out how to put a traffic light up here to please the natives? There's something wrong in your listening modality. You're not listening to people talk to you. In other words, you got a constipated,
Eardrum.
upward dialogue that somebody's cutting it off, because you seem to be a reasonable guy. One lady said to me, another group of ladies, different part of the post, said to me, I wonder if you could persuade the post commander to keep our children from walking in the streets. And I said, tell me some more about that. And then she said, the problem is that there's no sidewalk on either side of the street in our housing area. So you have to tell the children to either walk in their neighbor's yard and beat down a path, or to walk in the street. And they do that at rush hour because it's the same time people are going to work.
School, right.
So I go back to see this same guy who's hopes I'll leave post quickly. And I say to him, you really need a heart-to-heart with your post engineer. You got a dumb post engineer. And if you think you're your own life in the Army, my general view of post engineers were they were very old men, always gray-headed old men, and they did what they damn pleased. And oh, by the way, the post engineer facilities were always the nicest place on post. But here's a common thing, like putting a sidewalk down, that the people who lived in the housing area couldn't understand why top management didn't know that they didn't have any sidewalks and didn't give a shit. So I think this family thing that we got going really did unleash an opportunity for people to believe that they too were enfranchised, that spouses were then enfranchised in trying to better build their lot as decent, law-abiding citizens on the post. Now, out of all this comes family action programs at the post-campus station level, family action programs in the educational school system, because we did the Leavenworth bit. We began to authorize travel by senior officers' wives at the grade of Major General, which we never did before, to let them go and visit, for example, if they had jobs, or lieutenant generals had jobs at various places, and wives were permitted to travel. Later on, I'm the TRADOC commander, and when I have my TRADOC commanders conference, I also have a wives conference along with it.
Oh, really?
So the post-camp and station commanders' wives came up and gave my staff a dump on things that ought to be done down there in order to prove the lot of the people at the post-camp station level. I think this also served us well. We got into things like teen suicide, teenage alcohol abuse, teenage drug abuse, variety of things that that because we invited it, it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so it released frustration and made people believe that things were going to be better. Guys like Don Starry, for example, pioneered mayoralty
Oh, was he the one?
business. He started that out at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And, you know, everybody took that on and it became commonplace to have a mayor.
Were mayors elected or appointed?
Started out getting appointed, then later on they got elected. It may vary from one place to another in order to make sure you got permanence, you know, something. But I would never have thought of going to a post as a vice chief of staff of the Army if I didn't meet with the mayors. So it turned a big switch from off to on.
It certainly did, yeah.
And when you turn it to on, then you got to expect the current to flow. You have raised expectations, and you have to meet them.
Right. So people have to change their behavior, way of doing business,
You
and,
bet.
and money has to be
No,
raised.
the other thing is, see, the post commanders knew that there was a referral mechanism to higher authority. Because there were hotlines established in the flow office. Some lady at Fort Swampy wanted to talk to the flow lady at the Department of the Army, so be it.
Just grabs the
Pick it
phone.
up, call, like we advertise it.
Well, in this way, you empowered
Very much so.
wives.
Very much so.
And meanwhile, there still is a sort of fear that you mentioned in connection with exceptional family members. The soldier figures if he gets too high a profile, he'll end up getting screwed. If he makes waves, he'll get screwed one way or another. So this then ties back in with the OE business, which is something else I wanted to ask you about. Did that start before you got into the head shed?
Yeah. That started with Bernie Rogers as the desk spur. And so if you look back in the time sequence of that, Rogers was a desk spur in the mid-70s.
Yeah, well, you were
Before he went down to the Tradoc commander, before he went down to be the Force Comp commander. So I guess he was the desk spur like in 74, 75, somewhere back in there.
So did he cook it up on his own, or did he have?
I don't know the circumstances there. That's one of those things that needs to be written up, but I don't know all that.
Yeah.
My notion, my hypothesis, he kept a very close relationship with a gentleman named John Galvin, who was the chairman of the board of Motorola. And
Yeah,
Motorola,
they were kids together, weren't
yeah, and Motorola pioneered a lot of human resource work. Whether or not he was influenced by that, I can't tell you. My notion is that he was, but at the same time, you recall there were some studies at the Army War College on, this is following the Vietnam War,
they?
like in 71, 70, 71, 72, about the moral bankruptness of the officer corps. Lieutenant colonels thought all generals lied. And Rogers knew a lot about that. And guys like Mike Malone, guys like John Johns. John Johns came in and was the human behavioralist. And he and Walt Tomer were sort of successive guys running that stuff for Bernie Rogers.
Who did it first, Walt?
I don't recall. Don't know the order of march.
So they were in the desk per shop,
Yeah, and they were in the HR shop, human resources shop.
which is where OE had its home.
Yeah.
So was there any Was that shop still in existence when you became desk per?
Yeah,
And it disappeared after a bit.
it did after I left.
You kept it alive.
Yeah, I think it disappeared when Ono took it over. The guy that ran it while I was there, let's see, his name is, he was formerly the commander in Berlin, or went from there to be the commander in Berlin. I have to think about who he was. He's a retired major general. And then I think Ono abolished it, Chuck, after he came in and took Elton's place.
Closed down the school and all that.
Well, the school went out. The school went out. Probably about the time I became the vice.
So it's gone, but it left the legacy of the after-action review. And what I'm seeing here is multiple channels of empowerment of subordinates and opening of communications across echelons.
You bet.
And was that an idea that was growing in a lot of people's heads, or was that one of Shy's? Well, no, Bernie came before Shy.
I think that there was a group of people. I think Bernie was one of them. I think Shy was one of them. I think Don Story was one of them. In fact, I know he was, because he spent a considerable amount of time on living theory. There's a guy at the University of Louisville who Don had met when he was commander at Fort Knox. The guy wrote a book on living theories about this thick. It's one of these tomes, and terrifically difficult book to get at.
Is it about theory or about living?
It's about the theory of living. And you had this coterie of guys who had been built in the OE domain, who were actively at work, pushing and cajoling commanders to go through this business of listening to their subordinates. That, quote, forced, unquote, listening to your subordinates, which became the vogue. That is to say, you will, within 30 days after your arrival, take your principal subordinates off and do an off-site and gain insights into how your command works. And oh, by the way, there is an OE facilitator available to help you at the division level or at the brigade level or whatever. That directive way to be put into a unit's life. And I knew that as a colonel down at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
It was there then?
Yeah. We did an annual retreat. Went over to Southern Pines or Pinehurst, where it was, and rented an inn over there and spent 3 days figuring out what we're going to do and listening to people. And
Who do you have, your battalion commanders?
no, I did. I was involved in it was battalion commanders and brigade commanders, and we were doing business with the division commander. So I remember Jack Forrest was involved in it. And Jack was a guy who was intimately involved in these kinds of matters. And Jack was busy running that particular program for Fritz Crozen as the division commander.
He was one of Fritz's staff officers?
No, he was ADC.
Oh.
He's a brigadier general at the time. So this thing was going on all over the Army. And there was this coterie of guys, a lot of them had been in the behavioral science department at West Point. who had persuaded a number of senior leaders, Rogers, Meyer, Starry, and others, to empower people. See, Don Starry's mayoralty business at Fort Knox when he's a major general is empowering people. You follow me?
Right.
And I remember when I was the resource manager at Tradoc, he called me up on the phone and said, I want you to come down there and spend 3 days with me, and I'm going to show you how to run a post, because you never run a post. But you're providing money to run posts, therefore you ought to learn how to run posts. And I went around and met all the mayors and listened to all the bitches and gripes and complaints and good stuff and bad stuff, and I saw things I never saw before in a post. And so that was going on in the years 70, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's 7 years of this going on in the Army. I'm meeting it when I go to take a brigade level command. So a group of colonels like me going to the meeting with my division commander and my ADC, who've been told this is what you're going to do. When we get to be generals, it's okay. You follow me? It's a piece of cake, and so it's not a problem. We can listen to anybody, bitch, gripe, complain, or whatever it may be, and make sure you do that. It makes you do it without worrying about it.
Right.
It sort of says, I'm open for business. You can tell me any damn thing. I'm not going to get mad because you tell me something. And even if it's bad news, I'll listen to it and we'll get on to it. So there was this, so if you look at a post, there was this group of people that lived on the post. They're called family members. And then there was a group of people who were the civilian workers on the post who provided the services for the people that lived on the post, but they didn't live on the post. And then there was the group of people who were the soldiers that lived on the post, whose duty it was to go train hard, forget the families, and leave the families in the care of this disinterested group of civilians who didn't live on the post. So this OE mechanism began to radiate from how to improve the unit per se, about its training program, its goals, its ambitions as a unit. It began to move out and take into consideration what did the family have to say about it, because we began to perceive that the family was, in a volunteer system, the family tells the spouse whether he is going to re-enlist or not.
Yes.
So there was a natural progression and evolution from the cataclysmic days of 78, 79, 80, when people were beating themselves coming and going to Europe and the like, that the forces set into motion by the OE system in terms of trying to improve unit performance began to extend to family performance and to post-camp and station performance. And then releasing that family deal through the family program became an empowering association. Then there were two groups that then beat up on the civilian population that didn't live there anymore, which were the families that beat the hell out of them and the management that beat the hell out of them. And so then you see later, when I get there as a desk clerk, one of the things I find out is we're not paying enough attention to the civilians. Who are the people that manage all these things for us, make it nice for us and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, as an example, one of the things we did was we created a system of gongs medals. They could be, I mean, actual tangible medals that have bits of ribbon and round circles on the bottom of it that mirrored the active component medal system, so that commanders could give these things out to tell civilians that we thought a lot of. Later, as we began to put out things for bid under the infamous OPM regulation, or the, not OPM, but the OMB regulation that was signed into effect, that said you have to bid various and sundry things for civilian competition to bid on. We then said, my God, we got to have the contractors brought into our family. So the Army family, narrowly described in a draft era as being soldiers, as we move into the volunteer era, becomes the soldier and his family. As we progress in the 80s, it now begins to include the civilian workforce, and pretty soon it also includes the contractor workforce. I can recall a chart which I used that talked about the Army family. And it had at the top of it active component. Then below that it had the National Guard. And below that it had the U.S. Army Reserve. And then it had the families of those in terms of married spouses, and then the children of the Army, the active, and the Army Reserve, or the Army Reserve, the active, the Guard and Reserve, spouses and children. And then it had the civilians and their spouses and their children. And then it included the contractor population we had working for us on the post-Kansas station. Sicilian people.
Sicilian people, yes.
And they're all part of the Army family.
Part of the Army family.
And we're supposed to be taking care of them. So this spilled out into the Guard and Reserve, because pretty soon their spouses had a Bill of Rights that they thought was important for them. So all this is what I would call is maturation of the understanding of who it is works for you. And I think we understand that probably better than any civilian guy going, I mean, in a comparable business. I mean, if you ask the chairman of IBM how many people in his firm are married and how many children do they have and all that, I'm not sure he'd know that right off the top of his head.
The General Motors Exceptional Family Member Program.
Yeah. I'm not sure they'd know what we're talking. So sum all that up. I think that the Army Family Program that Myers started, I just happened to be the first lieutenant about it, really got something going. And it made the spouses of the Army feel like that they were partners in what it was we do. And I think what happened then as a result of that when tragedies occurred, like in Gander, when Somalia occurs, when the Persian Gulf goes, we had very strong families and very strong institutions inside the Army to safeguard the families. If it's World War II, you don't have to worry about it. It takes care of itself, because everybody's involved in it. When you're, the smaller the Army gets, I mean, the notion today would be the smaller the Army gets now, the more it will be,
Each person.
the more resilient it will be if its families are well taken care of.
Yeah,
That's more than you ever wanted to hear about families.
Well, I think it's a
chapter in your book.
it's a very important component of this whole personnel story. and I'd never really thought of it before, the multiple currents working in the same direction.
One of the guys who's very good at that is a cavalryman named Jack Woodmansee. Jack was a commander of a corps in Germany, and I recall even as the vice chief, he invited me to come over there one time to speak to this group of people. And he had taken the whole corps command staff up to a German resort in sort of north of 5th Corps. And he brought in all kinds of people from outside, religious figures, behavioralists, that kind of stuff. Now, Jack is a terrific soldier. I mean, he really is a terrific soldier. But he had this personnel side to him. So I think a lot more people became personnelists than before. And things that you see now in the Army, where we use words like, we want you to take some storyline through the chain of command as its dissemination means. It gives you some notion that people are more comfortable with being able to rap with their subordinates, rap with their spouses and the like. I mean, the fact that we have spouse support stay-behind groups, if some unit goes out and deploys, or it goes to the National Training Center, or whether it goes overseas to Somalia. All those things are oiled up so that there's an adequate, robust family support activity. The other services were slow to follow.
Even the Navy submariners? Well, I guess that's
Well, Navy
isolated.
submarines may be a separate case,
Yeah,
but
that's
I'm
a
talking about
special case.
the major part of the Navy was slow to follow. Now the Navy is big in this, because they realize they got big time problems with
Potential
families,
problems.
separation, all that kind of stuff. So they've got some real nice formal programs going, but they took them a long time to get into. They took the lead from us.
Yeah, it does seem like the Army's on the leading edge of most of these.
Well, we are people intensive,
Yeah.
and therefore we ought to be on the leading edge.
Right. Well, in the cohort story, one of the things that I've been feeling for, and maybe I should feel for it with people other than you, is what is it that's different about a mechanized infantry battalion or a tank battalion as compared to a light or airborne infantry battalion that makes those armored units less amenable to cohort? Is there anything, or is it simply the fact that there's a lot of them overseas and not very many of them in the States, so there wasn't much chance to rotate the people?
I think the system is driven more by the Army's, I think the resistance was driven more by the Army's readiness system.
Oh, really? Boy, they didn't like having a unit be C3 for 4
Well,
or 6 months?
if you think about it for a moment, in an infantry, let's say a straight leg infantry unit, like the 7th ID, for example, the amount of equipment in that unit is small indeed. In the case of the tankers, 4 men get a tank.
Yeah.
And in a Bradley or an armored personnel carrier, you got 9 guys running an APC or a Brad. Now, there is a tremendous amount of work that goes on every day about keeping that stuff maintained right. So I think one of the problems in the mechanized forces was the fact that on the 15th day of every month, you had to report status of equipment, status of people, and the like. So to say that there were any restrictions going to be put around about the mobility of people in the units, moving them from one platoon to another, moving them from one squad to another, moving from one company to another, to level it out so that you could take care of all this maintenance and the like, was perceived to be unnecessarily restrictive on battalion commanders and brigade commanders and division commanders. Secondly, except for Korea, which was pulling light forces to Korea in the 2nd Division, in the main, the heavy units in the States were on a treadmill with the heavy units abroad. And therefore, people were constantly coming in and going out of the units. And therefore, if you began to say, we're going to fix one of these units at Fort Riley, that meant that you couldn't levy that unit at Fort Riley. And so that meant that everybody at Carson, Polk, Stewart, and Hood would have to pick up the slack. So that would grate on people. My own view about cohorting was that we ought to be able to line up the Big Red One to support the Big Red One in Germany, because there was a brigade at the Big Red One. And so here you had a case of 2 brigades in the States backing up 1 brigade abroad. And so the relationship is pretty good about that, 2 to 1. In the case of the 4th, they didn't have 1 abroad. In the case of the 2nd AD, they did, up at Garlstadt. So you could take certain units and get them sort of on a rotating basis with their corps buddies abroad. But getting a company or a battalion located in the Big Red One, ready to ship it to Augsburg, or Durpingen, or wherever the hell that thing was down there, Ulm, I guess, said, well, gee whiz, when these people come into Ulm, we'll have to displace half the people that are already here in order to make it available, the facilities available for the new battalion to come in. And that grated on various and sundry people, because there were waiting lists for people to get quarters in various and sundry places. So it just became a big time problem to organize effectively how to do it with the mechanized units and the Army units. As a matter of fact, in the Army units, you were exactly tangent in numbers of battalions overseas and number of battalions in the United States. So you didn't have this 2 to 1 ratio, luxury of that ratio, by the way.
But a cohort unit doesn't need replacements except a periodic
It needs
plus a package
it
of
needs the
reformers.
initial replacement.
The category.
Well, it has to have the first load.
Right,
In other words, you got to send the 1st battalion,
right.
which meant somebody's going to get discombobulated at the other end, because there's an existing battalion there.
Startup is a son of a bitch.
Startup is a son of a bitch. And
And
nobody
startup-
liked the startup function.
And startup killed it then.
Startup killed it. See, a lot of this was an operations research schema. We went through, we must have looked at 100 different ways to do it. When the reload, when the startup point was, when the reload point is, what the attrition rate will be on average. Whether you have a 2-2-1 or 1-2-1 or 2-1-2, you know, 100 different ways to look at getting it started up and keeping it supported. And one of the things I look back on that I probably shouldn't have done, I let anybody that wanted to look at a way to do it, we put it in the grinder, because we're trying to build acceptance by the people below. But I think in the end, the 220-1 report caused people to have trouble, and that is nobody wanted to report a Unit C5 while I was going through this, quote, getting to know Europe game. Navy does this all the time.
Yes.
Navy does it with 1/3 of its aircraft carriers. They cost $3.5 billion of the boat and $3.5 billion for the aircraft, and they think nothing about it.
They shut that bugger down for a while.
You bet. But the Army has a psyche about the 220-1 report.
Yes. What, do you know the history of that? That's something that's never been written. I mean, that's one of the things that's...
The history of the report?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is a
around.
JCS requirement you have to report on readiness. So the Army can't bring itself, except when you're changing out equipment, when you're going from the 113 to the Bradley, or the M68-3 to the Abrams tank. The Army has a history of saying then, any other time, if you're not C3, C2, or C1, you're a dirty bird. And therefore, you're going to break your back to make sure on the 15th day of every month that you have a very high readiness factor. So if you get a bunch of personnel weenies coming in there telling you what to do about protecting this company, you can't take anybody out of this company. Can't take anybody out of this company to cross-level the battalion to make the battalion better.
Yeah, so you got one C1 company and all the others are C3 or 4.
That's right. And you can't take anybody out of this battalion if it's a C1 battalion and make the other 2 sister battalions who are C3, make them C2. Oh, by the way, they got work to do every morning. Got to take care of all these tanks and all these Bradleys and all that. So you see, it had some baggage with it.
Yeah.
Which, because of what I believe is the heavy equipment industry associated with the mechanized forces, and the difficult startup time, that made it not a salutary thing that the mechanized leaders wanted to get into.
Did any, in doing the crunching of the various kinds of units, various systems, what sort of training depressed readiness times were you getting? And for example, suppose you'd shut down a unit in Germany and reloaded it with people out of OSIT, and it would be at a training level very depressed for a certain amount of time. Was there heartburn about that too? I mean, one battalion out of every division would probably be in a non-combat ready state for 4 to 6 months.
Division commanders, corps commanders, and user commanders in Germany didn't want any part of that.
They wouldn't tolerate that. Apparently the units come up fairly fast. Maybe one of the problems in Germany was finding training areas to bring units up.
Well, you had
fast.
discombobulated training area, you know, you're not worth a damn unless you go down to table 8 over here, table 12.
Right.
Therefore, we got to screw around the range
Scheduling.
stuff, scheduling. We've got this all locked in place for 2 years. And now this battalion, you're going to insert this battalion, and we got to make some room for them. You know, you name the obstacle,
They came up with
and
it.
they raised it.
Yeah.
Now, the first time that we made a major move on changing it is when Carl Vono, in the Getting Ready for Desert Storm, made a decision that he would take 100 tank crews, and 100 Bradley crews, and 100 artillery crews, and stockpile them, ready to send them into the battle, should we have taken a large number of casualties. And so, we did begin the notion of unit replacement at a very small unit level in Desert Storm.
None were ever sent, were they?
Whether they were I think they were stockpiled in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, they were there.
I think so.
Actually were deployed.
I think so.
So what they did then was deplete the strength of other units, mostly back in the States, I guess?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. A good friend of mine was a battalion commander at that time in Germany. He got levied for 10 squads. I'm making that up. Okay, he got levied for 10 squads as replacements. And then he received from the United States 10, said squad, he's tank battalion commander, 10 tank crews out of 56 in his battalion. He then got 10 reserve tank crews, which had been, you know, the RTP-18 or whatever, RT-12 guys who had gotten out in the last year. They were called in. And he did very well, by the way. And they were sent to backfill his tank battalion. Then when he got his crews back from Saudi Arabia, he then released the reserves from his battalion, came back to the States and were demobilized. They were members of the individual ready reserve, but they'd gotten out within the last 12 months.
That sounds like a workable proposition. Next thing I wanted to ask you about was the business of balancing MOSs, which you did on the weekends.
Yep.
What happened? What would you do, and what would other people in Desper and Milpersen do?
Well, what you did, you had some manipulable tools, which, if exercised, you could change the number of people in an MOS in a reasonable period of time. Now let's say, what could you do in a year, for example? By manipulating the bonus system, you could cause people who were teetering on whether to stay in or get out. If you ran their bonus level from 3,000 to 10,000, they might teeter in as opposed to teeter out. So that's one way you can manipulate human behavior. Second way you can manipulate human behavior is you could lower the promotion points to grade E5 and E6. And you could change directions to the boards for E7s, 8s, and 9s.
Did the directions of the board tell them how many people in each MOS they could
My
promote?
MOS. It didn't before, but we invoked that. So the next time the E7 board came up, you could say, okay, we want to promote 500 more infantrymen to grade E7, 300 more tankers, and only 10 mess stewards, and 10 thises, and 10 thats. I recall going over to Walter Reed one day, and I knew most of the MOSs, and I said, this guy, Europe, he was working on me. I said, what are you, 95 Juliet? Some esoteric thing. He said, yeah, I am. So what is your cutoff score? 990. $870. I said, when do you anticipate getting promoted? He said, I don't anticipate getting promoted for several years. I said, we're way overstrength in this MLS. So then you could appeal to guys in the overstrength MOSs that you would give them a re-enlistment bonus if they would agree to re-enlist and take a new set of training in a new MOS, and a lot of people did that. Well, what were you playing on here? You're playing on the economic man. Now, there are people who don't know what they're talking about, who would say, well, gee whiz, there's no place for the economic man in the military. And that is just utter bullshit. There's every place for the economic man in the military. You find it in the pilot crews today. You find it in the people who are serving in the doctor's ranks. You find it in skills that take a long time to train, let's say intelligence skills or linguistic intelligence skills or whatever. You want people to stay for a long time, so you're willing to pay them money to stay a long time. So, and oh, by the way, you're willing to pay another group higher college fund or whatever it may be in order to get them to serve in the more hazardous MOSs like infantry and rail. Plenty of room for the economic man and the paratroopers. We pay them $110 a month, and $55 for the enlisted. We've been paying them for years. We think nothing about paying submariners more money because they're going to have to stay underwater for 6 months at a time. We think nothing about paying deep sea divers a hazard pay for doing that kind of work.